Dear friends, after a tiring and stressful day, welcome to Mysterious Sleep Stories. Tonight we embark on a journey into the heart of Louisiana, a place where the past refuses to remain buried, where Spanish moss hangs like a curtain between worlds, and where the air is filled with whispered secrets. Tonight, we explore Myrtles Plantation in St. Francisville, Louisiana, a magnificent antebellum estate renowned as one of America's most haunted places. This isn't just a ghost story. Spirits certainly feature in our tale. This is a journey into 2 centuries of American history, the lives of those who dreamed their dreams on this land, and the countless souls who suffered here during one of the darkest chapters of our nation's past. So settle in. Let the day's tensions dissipate into the night, and prepare to immerse yourself in a story of beauty and tragedy, wealth built on suffering, legends with a grain of truth, and a house said to watch over those who dare to enter its halls. Close your eyes and let my voice transport you to the misty plains of Louisiana where Myrtles Plantation awaits. Part 1. The Land and the Setting. To truly understand the Myrtles Plantation, we must first immerse ourselves in the landscape that shaped it. Louisiana is unlike any other place in America, a land where cultures collided and blended in ways that created something entirely unique. Imagine, if you will, standing on the banks of the mighty Mississippi River, that great artery of the continent, watching the brown waters roll endlessly toward the Gulf of Mexico, carrying with them the sediment of half a continent. The region around St. Francisville, where the Myrtles stands, is part of what's known as the Feliciana Parishes, a section of Louisiana that sits on higher ground than much of the surrounding territory. This elevation, modest though it is, made all the difference in the days before modern flood control. While plantations in the lower-lying areas struggled with seasonal flooding, properties on the Tunica Hills enjoyed relative protection from the Mississippi's capricious moods. St. Francisville itself is one of Louisiana's oldest towns, established in the late 18th century when this region was still under Spanish control. The town takes its name from a Spanish Capuchin monastery that once stood here, and from its earliest days, it was a place where different cultures met and mingled. French colonists, Spanish administrators, Anglo-American settlers, enslaved Africans, free people of color, and Native Americans all contributed to the unique cultural tapestry of the region. The landscape here is hauntingly beautiful in a way that borders on the otherworldly. Massive live oak trees, some of them hundreds of years old, spread their branches in impossible directions, creating canopies so dense that even at midday, the light beneath them is soft and filtered. From these ancient branches hangs Spanish moss, not actually a moss at all, but an epiphytic plant that drapes the trees like gray-green curtains, swaying gently in the slightest breeze. In spring and summer, the air is thick with humidity, so heavy you can almost taste it. The temperature rises into the 90s, and the heat wraps around you like a wet blanket. Thunderstorms build with dramatic suddenness, turning afternoon into twilight, unleashing torrents of rain that drum on rooftops and run in rivers down the roads. Lightning splits the sky in jagged bolts, illuminating the landscape in stark, flickering moments that burn themselves into memory. But it's in the evening, as the sun sinks below the horizon and darkness spreads across the land, that this landscape truly reveals its character. The sounds change as daylight fades. Cicadas begin their rhythmic buzzing, creating a wall of sound so constant it becomes almost hypnotic. Frogs add their voices from every pond and ditch, a chorus that rises and falls in waves. Night birds call to one another with cries that sometimes sound eerily human. The scents change too. The heavy perfume of magnolia blossoms hangs in the still air. Jasmine releases its intoxicating fragrance as the temperature drops. The rich smell of earth, of green growing things, of decay and renewal happening simultaneously fills the nostrils. And beneath it all, there's a quality of stillness, a profound quiet that seems to wait for something, as if the land itself is holding its breath. It was into this landscape that European settlers came in the late 18th century, drawn by the promise of fertile soil and the opportunity to grow rich through agriculture. The land that would become the Myrtles Plantation was granted by the Spanish colonial government to men willing to develop it, to clear the forests and plant crops, to build the infrastructure of civilization in what was then considered the frontier. The Native Americans who had inhabited this region for thousands of years before European contact knew it as a place of power. The Tunica, the Homa, the Chitimacha peoples had lived here for millennia, and their spiritual tradition spoke of places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was particularly thin. When European settlers arrived, they brought their own supernatural beliefs, their own ghost stories and folklore, and these traditions would mingle with African spiritual practices brought by enslaved peoples and with Caribbean influences to create a unique spiritual landscape. In Louisiana, belief in the supernatural wasn't confined to the superstitious or uneducated. It permeated all levels of society. The Catholic Church, which dominated religious life in the region, had its own rich tradition of miracles, saints, and the intercession of the dead. Voodoo and hoodoo practices, brought from Africa and the Caribbean, provided a parallel spiritual framework that many people, both enslaved and free, drew upon. Protestant settlers from other parts of the United States brought their own traditions of ghosts and hauntings. The result was a culture where the boundary between the living and the dead was understood to be permeable, where certain people were believed to possess the ability to communicate with spirits, where rituals could influence supernatural forces for good or ill. This wasn't seen as primitive superstition, but as simple reality, part of the fabric of daily life. The Myrtles Plantation sits on Rough and Gray Road, just outside St. Francisville proper, on what was once 600 acres of land, but is now reduced to about 18 acres surrounding the main house. The approach to the property is important to understanding its character. You drive through countryside that hasn't changed dramatically in 150 years, past other old plantations, some restored and occupied, others slowly crumbling back into the earth from which they rose. Then you turn onto the property, and the house appears through the trees. It's a stunning sight even today, a long, low structure painted white, with columns supporting the roof of a magnificent veranda that wraps around multiple sides of the building. The architectural style is what's known as Louisiana Creole cottage, a distinctive regional form that adapted European building traditions to the unique demands of the Louisiana climate. The central feature of the Myrtles is its veranda, called a gallery in local parlance, stretching 125 feet across the front of the house. This covered porch served multiple purposes in the days before air conditioning. It provided shade from the brutal summer sun, allowing the interior rooms to stay relatively cool. It offered outdoor living space where families could sit in the evenings, catching whatever breeze might stir the heavy air. And it made a powerful architectural statement, announcing to anyone who approached that this was a house of substance, owned by people of means and taste. The gallery is decorated with elaborate cast iron railings in an intricate pattern of vines, leaves, and flowers. This ironwork was cast in New Orleans in the mid-1800s and shipped upriver to the plantation. Installing it would have been a significant undertaking, requiring careful measurement, precise fabrication, and skilled installation. The result was worth the effort, creating a visual masterpiece that has become one of the most photographed features of the Myrtles. The main house is built in the traditional raised cottage style, elevated several feet off the ground on brick piers. This elevation served several purposes. It protected the living spaces from flooding during heavy rains. It allowed air to circulate beneath the house, helping to keep the floors cool and reducing moisture that could lead to rot. And it created a crawl space that could be used for storage or, in some cases, as living quarters for enslaved domestic workers. The structure itself is wood frame construction, covered with clapboard siding and painted white. The roof is steeply pitched to shed the heavy rains that are common in Louisiana, and it's punctuated by dormer windows that bring light and air into the attic spaces. When the house was built, that roof would have been covered with wooden shingles that required regular replacement. Today, it's protected by more modern materials, but the basic form remains unchanged. Surrounding the house are gardens that have been restored to suggest their 19th century appearance, though they're not exact recreations. Camellia bushes bloom in winter, their perfect flowers seeming almost artificial in their flawless beauty. Azaleas explode with color in spring, painting the landscape in shades of pink, red, and white. Crepe myrtles, for which the plantation was eventually named, add their delicate blooms in summer. These gardens were maintained by enslaved workers who had no choice in the matter, who tended these flowers while their own lives were filled with hardship and deprivation. The grounds also include several outbuildings, some original to the plantation and others reconstructed or built more recently. There was once a kitchen building, separate from the main house, as was common in this period, to keep the heat and fire risk of cooking away from the living spaces. There were quarters where enslaved people lived, though these original structures are long gone. There were barns, storage buildings, workshops, all the infrastructure necessary to run a large agricultural operation. Behind the main house, stretching away toward the south, were the fields where the plantation's cash crops grew. In the early years, this was primarily indigo, a plant from which a valuable blue dye could be extracted. Later, cotton became the dominant crop, the white gold that made fortunes for plantation owners and brought misery to the enslaved people forced to cultivate it. These fields are gone now, subdivided and sold off over the decades as the plantation's acreage shrank. But in the antebellum period, they stretched for hundreds of acres, worked by dozens of enslaved people under the brutal Louisiana sun. The climate of this region plays no small role in the atmosphere of the Myrtles and places like it. Louisiana's subtropical climate means that decay happens quickly here. Wood rots, metal rusts, fabric mildews, paint peels. Without constant maintenance, structures return to nature with remarkable speed. This created a constant battle for the families who lived here, a need to continually repair and restore just to keep the house standing. But this climate also gives the Myrtles a kind of organic quality, as if it's a living thing rather than just a structure of wood and brick and plaster. The house breathes with the weather, expanding in the heat, contracting in the rare cold snaps. Floorboards creak and settle. Doors that closed properly yesterday might stick today as humidity swells the wood. Windows that opened easily in dry weather refuse to budge when moisture is in the air. This physical reality certainly explains some of the phenomena people experience here. Footsteps in the night might be nothing more than old wood settling as temperatures drop. Doors that open and close by themselves might be responding to changes in air pressure or moisture levels. But explaining away some of the phenomena doesn't explain all of it. And the people who have lived and worked at the Myrtles over the years will tell you there's more happening here than simple physics can account for. As you stand on the grounds of the Myrtles today, as a visitor or an overnight guest, you can feel the weight of history pressing down. This is a place where tremendous human drama has unfolded over 2 centuries. Joy and sorrow, love and hatred, birth and death, freedom and bondage, all have left their mark on this land. The house has witnessed the best and worst of human nature, and some believe it remembers everything. Part 2. David Bradford and the Whiskey Rebellion. The story of the Myrtles Plantation begins, appropriately enough, with someone running from something. In 1794, a lawyer named David Bradford found himself on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of President George Washington, and he fled westward to escape the consequences of his actions. David Bradford was born in Maryland in 1762 into a family of some education and means. He studied law and established himself as an attorney in Washington County, Pennsylvania, in the western frontier of that state. This was rough country in the late 1700s, far from the refined civilization of Philadelphia or New York. The people who settled here were independent-minded, suspicious of government authority, and quick to take offense at any perceived infringement on their liberties. In 1791, the new federal government, desperate for revenue to pay off debts from the Revolutionary War, imposed an excise tax on distilled spirits. This was the first tax levied by the new government on a domestic product, and it was deeply unpopular, especially in western Pennsylvania, where many farmers supplemented their income by turning their grain into whiskey. For these frontier farmers, whiskey wasn't just a beverage. It was currency, trade goods, and a practical solution to a transportation problem. Grain was bulky and difficult to transport over the primitive roads of the frontier. It spoiled quickly if not stored properly. But whiskey concentrated the value of that grain into a form that was easy to transport, didn't spoil, and commanded good prices in eastern markets. The excise tax threatened this entire economic system. Resistance to the tax began almost immediately. Tax collectors were harassed, threatened, tarred, and feathered. Their homes were burned. The opposition organized itself into armed groups, and by 1794, the situation had deteriorated into open rebellion. David Bradford found himself at the center of this uprising, not by accident, but by choice. Bradford was one of the leaders of what became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. He used his legal knowledge and rhetorical skills to organize resistance and his willingness to take direct action to intimidate federal officials. The rebellion reached its peak in the summer of 1794 when Bradford led a force of several hundred armed men in an attack on the home of General John Neville, the regional tax inspector. The house was burned, shots were fired, and casualties occurred on both sides. President George Washington, determined to demonstrate that the new federal government would not tolerate armed rebellion, called up a militia force of nearly 13,000 men to put down the uprising. This was an enormous force for the time, larger than the army Washington had commanded during most of the Revolutionary War. The message was clear. The federal government had the power and the will to enforce its laws. Most of the rebel leaders either submitted to federal authority or fled before the troops arrived. David Bradford chose to flee, and he chose to run as far and as fast as he could. In October of 1794, he slipped away from Pennsylvania, making his way down the Ohio River on a coal barge. Legend has it that soldiers boarded the boat at one point, but the crew helped Bradford avoid capture, even throwing the soldiers into the river. Bradford continued south, eventually reaching Spanish West Florida, territory that would later become part of Louisiana, but was then under Spanish control and thus beyond the reach of American law. He settled in an area the Spanish called Bayou Serra, near what is now St. Francisville, and in 1796, he purchased 600 acres of land from a Spanish land grant. It's worth pausing here to consider what this journey must have been like. Bradford was leaving behind everything he had known: his home, his legal practice, his position in society. He was traveling hundreds of miles through frontier wilderness, knowing that if he was caught, he would likely hang for treason. The stress must have been enormous, and yet he persevered, driven by the instinct for survival and perhaps by the hope that he could rebuild his life in this distant territory. Bradford called his new plantation Laurel Grove, named for the laurel trees that grew in the area. He set about establishing himself as a planter, and he was joined eventually by his wife Elizabeth and their 5 children, who made the difficult journey from Pennsylvania to join him in exile. The house he built wasn't the Myrtles as we know it today. That original structure was much smaller, probably just 4 or 5 rooms, built in the style typical of late 18th century Louisiana frontier housing. It would have been a raised cottage, elevated on piers to avoid flooding and to allow air circulation underneath, with wide porches for outdoor living during the brutal summer months. The construction would have been cypress wood, which resists rot better than most other woods in Louisiana's humid climate, with a roof of wooden shingles that would need regular replacement. It was a substantial house by frontier standards, but modest compared to what would come later. To work his plantation, Bradford relied, as all planters did, on enslaved labor. Exactly how many enslaved people lived and worked at Laurel Grove in its early years, we can't say with certainty. Records from this period are fragmentary at best, and in the frontier conditions of Spanish West Florida, record-keeping was often haphazard. What we do know is that the plantation operated on the same brutal system of forced labor that characterized slavery throughout the South. Enslaved people cleared the land, planted and tended the crops, processed the harvest, maintained the buildings and grounds, cooked the meals, cleaned the house, and performed every other task necessary to keep the plantation running. Their lives were ones of unrelenting hardship and constant degradation. They had no legal rights, no recourse against abuse, no hope of freedom unless their enslavers chose to grant it, which rarely happened. Bradford focused his agricultural efforts primarily on indigo production. Indigo was one of the major cash crops of Louisiana in this period, valued for the blue dye that could be extracted from the plant. The process of growing and processing indigo was labor-intensive and required considerable expertise. The leaves had to be harvested at exactly the right time, then soaked in vats of water and beaten to separate the dye particles. The resulting indigo paste was dried into cakes that could be shipped to markets in New Orleans and beyond. In 1799, Bradford received a pardon from President John Adams, clearing his name and allowing him to settle his affairs in Pennsylvania. He returned there at least once, in 1801, to officially sell his property, but he never moved back. Louisiana had become his home, and he lived out the rest of his days at Laurel Grove. Bradford died in 1808 at the age of 46. The cause of his death isn't recorded in the documents that survive, but disease was always a threat in Louisiana's subtropical climate. Yellow fever, malaria, and other mosquito-borne illnesses swept through the region in waves, killing without regard to class or race. Bradford was buried on the plantation grounds, as was common in this period, though the exact location of his grave has been lost to time. The plantation passed to his daughter, Sarah Matilda Bradford, who had married a lawyer named Clark Woodruff. It's with the Woodruff family that the plantation would enter its most prosperous period and, if the legends are to be believed, its most haunted. But before we move to that era, it's worth spending a moment more with David Bradford's legacy. He was a man who led an armed rebellion against his government, who fled to avoid justice, who built a new life on the backs of enslaved people. He was also a man of education and ability, someone who could have accomplished much had his life not been derailed by the Whiskey Rebellion. His flight to Louisiana and his establishment of Laurel Grove set in motion a chain of events that would continue for 2 centuries. The house he built would be expanded and transformed, but its foundations, both literal and metaphorical, were laid by Bradford. The system of slavery he established here would persist for another 60 years until the Civil War brought it to a violent end. And the land he claimed, clearing away the forests that had stood for millennia, would bear the marks of human habitation long after his death. Part 3. The Woodruff Era and the Plantation's Golden Age. Clark Woodruff married Sarah Matilda Bradford in 1817, when he was 35 years old and she was just 14. To modern sensibilities, this seems shocking, but such marriages were not uncommon in the early 19th century, particularly in the South, where girls were often married young to secure family alliances and property transfers. Woodruff was a lawyer, like his father-in-law had been, and he had studied under David Bradford himself. The 2 men had become close, and Bradford apparently approved of Woodruff as a husband for his daughter. The newlyweds honeymooned at the Hermitage, the Tennessee home of Andrew Jackson, who was a friend of Woodruff's and would later become President of the United States. When David Bradford died in 1808, Clark Woodruff didn't immediately take over the plantation. It was managed for several years by Bradford's widow, Elizabeth, and then by Sarah and Clark together. But gradually, Woodruff assumed full control, and under his management, the plantation would undergo significant changes. The first major shift was in crops. While Bradford had focused on indigo, Woodruff recognized that cotton was becoming the dominant cash crop of the Deep South. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had revolutionized cotton processing, making it possible to separate seeds from fibers much more quickly than had been possible by hand. This technological innovation, combined with insatiable demand from textile mills in England and the northern United States, created a cotton boom that would reshape the Southern economy. Woodruff shifted production from indigo to cotton, expanding his operations significantly. Cotton cultivation was brutally demanding work, requiring intense labor during planting and especially during harvest season. Enslaved people worked from dawn to dusk during harvest, picking cotton by hand under the scorching sun, racing against the weather to get the crop in before rains could damage it. As the plantation's productivity increased, so did the number of enslaved people Woodruff owned. Census records show that in 1820, the family owned 5 enslaved people, but by 1830, that number had grown to 32. These people lived in simple cabins in the slave quarters, structures that provided minimal shelter and no privacy. Families were crowded together, their few possessions hung on pegs or stored in simple wooden boxes. But Woodruff's ambitions extended beyond agricultural success. He wanted his home to reflect his status as a successful planter and prominent citizen. The modest house David Bradford had built was no longer adequate for Woodruff's vision of himself and his family's place in Louisiana society. So in the 1830s, he undertook a major expansion and renovation of the house. This renovation transformed the structure from Bradford's relatively modest four-room cottage into something much grander. The house was expanded to include more and larger rooms, creating the floor plan that still exists today. The famous galleries were added, those magnificent covered porches with their elaborate cast iron railings that have become iconic symbols of the Myrtles. The cast iron railings deserve special attention. They were cast in New Orleans, a city that was rapidly becoming one of the most architecturally sophisticated in the South. The pattern is intricate, featuring intertwined vines, flowers, and leaves in a design that suggests both delicacy and strength. The railings surround the galleries on multiple sides of the house, creating an almost lace-like border between the covered porches and the world beyond. Inside the renovated structure, the rooms reflected the formal elegance that wealthy Southerners considered essential to proper living. The entry hall, which visitors still see when they enter the Myrtles today, features ornate plasterwork on the ceilings, polished wooden floors, and a sense of grandeur designed to impress guests. The parlors were furnished with pieces ordered from New Orleans or imported from Europe, upholstered in rich fabrics, designed for entertaining. The dining room received special attention, and it's in this room that one of the Myrtles' most famous allegedly haunted objects would eventually reside. The mirror. This mirror, a massive piece with an elaborate gilded frame, was installed during the Woodruff renovations. According to tradition, when someone died in the house, all the mirrors were supposed to be covered with black cloth to prevent the deceased spirit from becoming trapped in the reflection. Sarah Matilda and Clark had children together, though the exact number is disputed in various historical accounts. What we know for certain is that the family experienced tragedy, as virtually all families did in this period of high mortality rates. Disease was a constant threat, especially for children. Yellow fever, malaria, typhoid, and other illnesses swept through Louisiana regularly, and medical knowledge was primitive by modern standards. It's here that we need to address one of the most famous legends of the Myrtles, the story of Chloe. According to this tale, which has been repeated in countless books and television shows, Clark Woodruff had a relationship with an enslaved woman named Chloe, who worked as a house servant. When his interest in her waned, she began eavesdropping on family conversations, trying to learn what would happen to her. When she was caught, Woodruff had her ear cut off as punishment. According to the legend, Chloe then baked a cake for one of the daughter's birthdays, mixing oleander leaves into the batter. Oleander is indeed highly toxic, containing cardiac glycosides that can cause nausea, vomiting, irregular heartbeat, and death. The story claims that Sarah Matilda and two daughters ate the poisoned cake and died in agony. The other enslaved people at the plantation, fearing collective punishment, supposedly hanged Chloe and threw her body into the Mississippi River. It's a compelling story, filled with drama and tragedy. There's only one problem. There's no historical evidence that any of it actually happened. Extensive research into the property records of the Woodruff family which are still available and on file as public record in St. Francisville, has found no evidence that the Woodruffs ever owned an enslaved person named Chloe or Cleo. More significantly, the historical record contradicts the core claim of the story. Sarah Matilda Woodruff was not poisoned. She died on July 15, 1823, but not from oleander poisoning. According to parish records, she likely died from yellow fever, as did two of her children, James and Cornelia, who died in the same time period. Yellow fever was a devastating disease in Louisiana during this era, killing thousands of people in regular epidemics. Mary Octavia, often identified in the legend as one of the poisoned daughters, survived well into adulthood. She didn't die as a child from eating poisoned cake. This historical fact alone disproves the Chloe story as it's commonly told. So if the story isn't historically accurate, where did it come from? One possibility is that it's an amalgamation of multiple different stories and traditions. Poisoning fears were common on plantations, reflecting the very real anxiety among enslavers that the people they held in bondage might seek revenge through poison. Enslaved people often had access to food preparation and medicinal herbs, and this access created fear among white families. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women by white enslavers was a tragic reality throughout the South. While we have no evidence that Clark Woodruff had a relationship with a woman named Chloe, the power dynamics described in the story reflect real patterns of abuse. Enslaved women had no ability to refuse the sexual advances of their enslavers, and white wives had little recourse beyond quiet suffering. The story of Chloe might reflect collective memory of such abuses, even if the specific events didn't occur at the Myrtles. It gives a name and a face to the countless enslaved women whose stories were never recorded, who suffered in silence, whose pain was never acknowledged. Despite the lack of historical evidence for the Chloe story, visitors to the Myrtles have reported seeing a figure matching her description, a woman in period clothing wearing a green turban or head wrap. These sightings occur in various locations around the property, though they're most commonly reported in the main house and near where the slave quarters once stood. Clark Woodruff died on March 19, 1861, just weeks after the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter that began the Civil War. His death meant he was spared the experience of seeing the plantation system collapse, of watching the world he had known and profited from disintegrate. His widow, Sarah Matilda, his daughter, not his first wife, would have to navigate the chaos of the war years and the uncertain peace that followed. The Woodruff era represents the plantation's peak of prosperity, at least from the perspective of the white family that owned it. The house had been expanded and beautified. The agricultural operation was productive, and the family enjoyed a position of respect in local society. But this prosperity came at a terrible cost, one paid entirely by the enslaved people who made it all possible. Every dollar of profit the plantation generated represented hours of backbreaking labor performed by enslaved people under threat of violence. Every comfort the Woodruff family enjoyed was built on a foundation of human suffering. The elegant house, the beautiful gardens, the refined lifestyle, all of it was sustained by systematic exploitation and degradation of other human beings. Part 4. The Sterling Family and William Winter's Murder. In 1834, Clark Woodruff sold the plantation to Ruffin Gray Sterling. We don't know exactly why Woodruff decided to sell, though the death of his wife Elizabeth in 1831 may have played a role. By 1834, he and his surviving daughter Mary Octavia had moved to Covington, Louisiana, leaving a caretaker to manage the property until the sale was finalized. Ruffin Sterling and his wife, Mary Catherine Cobb, were people of considerable means, and they had grand plans for the property. They undertook an extensive remodeling of the house, nearly doubling the size of the former building. This expansion created the structure we see today, with its 9 bays across the front, its imposing double-door entrance, and its generous interior spaces. The Sterlings filled the house with imported furniture from Europe, creating an interior that reflected the latest in fashionable taste. It was during this time that the name was changed from Laurel Grove to the Myrtles, named for the crepe myrtle trees that grew in profusion around the property. These trees, with their distinctive bark and their clouds of delicate flowers in shades of pink, white, and purple, gave the plantation a romantic, almost dreamlike quality. But the Sterling renovation wasn't just about aesthetics. There's evidence that they believed spirits roamed the property because they incorporated features specifically designed to confuse or repel supernatural entities. Locks were installed upside down, based on a folk belief that spirits couldn't manipulate locks that were reversed. The front door was decorated with hand-painted stained glass windows featuring patterns of the French cross, which were believed to ward off evil. Whether these precautions were based on actual paranormal experiences or simply reflected common superstitions of the era, we can't say. But their presence tells us that concerns about the supernatural were taken seriously at the Myrtles, even in its earliest days. The Sterlings had 9 children, but only 4 of them survived to adulthood, a mortality rate that was sadly common in this period. Ruffin Sterling himself died on July 17, 1854, from tuberculosis, also known as consumption. He left his vast holdings in the care of his wife, Mary Cobb, who proved to be a remarkably capable businesswoman. She managed the plantation almost single-handedly for many years, earning the respect even of those who believed women weren't suited for such responsibilities. One of the Sterling daughters, Sarah Mulford Sterling, married William Drew Winter on June 3, 1852. Winter had been born in Bath, Maine, on October 28, 1820, the son of Captain Samuel Winter and Sarah Bowman. How he came to meet Sarah Sterling in distant Louisiana, we don't know, but their marriage would tie his fate to the Myrtles. William and Sarah had 6 children together: Mary, Sarah, Kate, Ruffin, William, and Francis. Tragically, Kate died from typhoid fever at the age of 3, another reminder of how precarious life was in this era. The family lived at various plantations in the area before Mary Cobb hired William as her agent and attorney in 1865, giving him and Sarah the Myrtles as their home. And it's here, on a January evening in 1871, that the only historically documented murder of the Myrtles occurred. According to the New Orleans Times, dated January 31st, 1871, William Winter was at home on the evening of January 26th. It was around 7 o'clock, and he was in the gentleman's parlor teaching a lesson to his sons. Suddenly, they heard the sound of a horse galloping up to the north gallery of the house. A voice called out, demanding to speak with a lawyer. Winter went to the door to see who was calling. As he appeared in the doorway, someone in the darkness fired a double-barrel shotgun at him. The gun was loaded with 7 large buckshot. 6 of them hit Winter, 5 in his chest, and 1 through his neck. The newspaper reported that he fell and expired instantly, without uttering a word. This account from a contemporary newspaper contradicts one of the most famous ghost stories associated with the Myrtles. The claim that William Winter staggered through the house and climbed the main staircase, dying on the 17th step in his wife's arms. The newspaper clearly states he died instantly where he fell on the porch. The discrepancy between the historical record and the legend is significant. The story of Winter climbing 17 steps and dying in his wife's arms is dramatic and tragic, perfect material for a ghost story. The actual event, sudden death on the porch, is no less tragic but lacks the narrative arc of the legend. Winter's murder was never solved, though 5 men, 4 black and 1 white, were arrested in May of 1871. They were described as being cognizant of the murder, suggesting they had knowledge of it, but there's no record of anyone being charged or convicted. A man named E.S. Weber was mentioned as standing trial, but no outcome was ever recorded. The murder occurred during a violent period in Louisiana history. The Civil War had ended just 6 years earlier, and Reconstruction was in full swing. Federal troops occupied the South, enforcing new laws that granted citizenship and voting rights to formerly enslaved people. White Southerners, particularly the former planter class, resisted these changes with everything from legal maneuvering to outright terrorism. Some researchers have theorized that William Winter was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. Winter was known to be a vocal opponent of the Klan, and his murder occurred at the height of Klan activity in Louisiana. The fact that it was never solved, despite arrests being made, suggests that powerful forces may have protected the killer. Sarah Winter was devastated by her husband's death. She remained at the Myrtles with her mother and siblings, but she never remarried. She died in April 1878 in St. Louis, Missouri, at the age of 44. She's buried next to her husband and daughter Kate at Grace Episcopal Church Cemetery in St. Francisville. Mary Cobb Sterling outlived her daughter by only 2 years, dying in 1880. The plantation passed to her son Stephen, but by this time it was heavily in debt. The Civil War had destroyed the economic foundation of the plantation system. Slavery was abolished, cotton prices were unstable, and the South was struggling to rebuild. Stephen sold the Myrtles in 1886 to Orrin D. Brooks, ending the Sterling family's ownership after more than 50 years. Brooks kept it until 1889, and the plantation changed hands several more times over the following decades, entering a long period of decline that would last well into the 20th century. But while the Sterlings were gone, their legacy remained. The house they had expanded and beautified still stood. And if the stories are to be believed, the spirits of those who had lived and died there remained as well, trapped in a kind of eternal present, endlessly reenacting the dramas of their lives. Part 5, Decline, Abandonment, and the Modern Era. The decades following the Civil War were difficult ones for the Myrtles, as they were for plantation houses throughout the South. The economic system that had supported these grand estates was gone, destroyed by the abolition of slavery and the devastation of the war. Former plantation owners struggled to maintain their properties without the forced labor that had previously made them profitable. The Myrtles changed hands multiple times in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, passing through various owners who had different levels of success in maintaining the property. In 1891, it was purchased by Harrison Milton Williams, a Mississippi widower. The Williams family would own the property for several decades, but by the early 20th century, the land surrounding the house had been divided among the Williams heirs, and the house itself was sold separately. By the 1950s, the Myrtles was in serious need of restoration. That's when it was purchased by Marjorie Munson, an Oklahoma widow who had been made wealthy by chicken farms. Munson was the first owner to report experiencing paranormal phenomena at the house. She claimed to see a figure wearing a green turban, which would become identified with the legendary Chloe. She also reported other odd occurrences that she couldn't explain. Whether Munson actually experienced something supernatural or whether her expectations shaped her perceptions, we can't know. But her reports marked the beginning of the Myrtles' modern reputation as a haunted house. In 1948, photographer Clarence John Laughlin included the plantation in his book Ghosts Along the Mississippi, helping to establish its place in Louisiana's haunted landscape. The 1960s saw more ownership changes, with various attempts at restoration and preservation. Then in the 1970s, the property was purchased by James and Frances Kermeen Myers, who transformed it into a bed and breakfast. This was a crucial turning point because it meant the house would be preserved and maintained while also becoming accessible to the public. Frances Kermeen would later write a book titled The Myrtles Plantation, the true story of America's most haunted house, published in 1994. This book, while containing numerous historical inaccuracies, helped cement the Myrtles' reputation as one of America's premier haunted locations. The title Most Haunted House in America became permanently attached to the property, appearing in countless articles, books, and television shows. The bed and breakfast operation created new opportunities for people to experience the Myrtles, to spend the night in rooms where previous families had lived and died. Guests began reporting their own experiences, strange sounds in the night, feelings of being watched, sightings of apparitions, objects moving on their own. These reports accumulated over the years, creating a rich catalog of paranormal activity. Tours of the house began to emphasize the ghost stories alongside the historical information. Daytime tours focused on architecture and history, while evening mystery tours highlighted the paranormal legends. These tours became increasingly popular, drawing visitors from across the country and around the world. In 2002, the television show Unsolved Mysteries filmed a segment about the alleged hauntings of the Myrtles. This was followed by appearances on Ghost Hunters in 2005, Ghost Adventures, and numerous other paranormal investigation shows. Each television appearance brought new waves of visitors, people hoping to have their own supernatural experiences. The current owners, John and Tita Moss, purchased the property in 2000 and have continued to operate it as a bed and breakfast, restaurant, and tourist attraction. They've expanded the offerings to include multiple guest rooms, a restaurant called the Carriage House, and both historical and mystery tours. The property now attracts tens of thousands of visitors each year. But the commercial success has come with questions about authenticity. How much of the Myrtles' haunted reputation is based on genuine paranormal activity, and how much is marketing? The legendary story of Chloe, which has no historical basis, continues to be told on tours and appears in promotional materials, even though researchers have thoroughly debunked it. This raises important questions about how we present history and how we balance the demands of commercial tourism with the responsibility to tell the truth. The Myrtles is a beautiful example of Louisiana plantation architecture, and it has a genuine, documented history of tragedy, including William Winter's murder. But does emphasizing the ghost stories, particularly ones we know to be false, disrespect that actual history? There's also the question of how we remember slavery. The Myrtles was built by enslaved people, maintained by enslaved people, and made profitable through the forced labor of enslaved people. That's an uncomfortable truth, one that doesn't fit easily into romantic ghost stories about antebellum elegance. Modern tours do acknowledge slavery, but the emphasis often remains on the white families who own the plantation and on the ghost stories rather than on the systematic exploitation and suffering that characterize the institution of slavery. Part 6. The Paranormal Claims and Investigations. Despite the questions about historical accuracy, there's no denying that people continue to report unusual experiences at the Myrtles. Whether these experiences are genuinely paranormal or have more mundane explanations, they form an important part of the plantation's modern identity. The reports span the full spectrum of paranormal phenomena. Visual apparitions are commonly reported, from full-bodied figures that appear solid enough to be mistaken for living people to shadowy forms and fleeting glimpses of movement. The woman in the green turban, identified with Chloe, is the most frequently described, but people also report seeing children, a woman in a black dress, and various other figures. Audio phenomena include footsteps, particularly on the main staircase where 17 distinct footfalls are sometimes counted before they stop. Voices, music from the piano in the parlor, doors opening and closing, and other sounds are regularly reported. Some visitors record electronic voice phenomena, capturing what they interpret as voices or other sounds that weren't audible at the time of recording. Tactile experiences include feeling of being touched by invisible hands, sudden temperature drops, and sensations of breath on the neck. Some guests report their covers being pulled off during the night or feeling the mattress depress as if someone is sitting on the bed. The famous mirror in the dining room continues to generate reports. Handprints appear on the glass, apparently from the inside. People see faces or figures in the reflection that aren't actually in the room. Photographs of the mirror sometimes show anomalies that weren't visible to the naked eye. Paranormal investigation teams have visited the Myrtles numerous times, bringing various types of equipment: electromagnetic field detectors, thermal imaging cameras, audio recorders, and motion sensors. They've reported anomalous readings, unexplained EMF spikes, temperature fluctuations, and apparent responses to questions posed to potential spirits. Skeptics offer alternative explanations for all of these phenomena. Old houses naturally produce sounds as wood settles and responds to temperature and humidity changes. Drafts from poorly sealed windows and doors can create the sensation of cold spots and can cause doors to move. The power of suggestion is considerable, especially when people visit a location they've been told is haunted. The mirror phenomena might result from the natural degradation of old glass and silvering, combined with the human tendency toward pareidolia, seeing patterns, particularly faces, in random stimuli. Photographs can be affected by dust, moisture, camera strap reflections, and various other mundane causes that create the appearance of anomalies. Sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucinations can explain many of the experiences people report in the bedrooms. These neurological phenomena occur at the threshold between waking and sleeping and can produce vivid hallucinations, feelings of presence, and temporary inability to move, all of which are genuinely terrifying even though they have a scientific explanation. But not all experiences occur during sleep or can be easily explained away. Some happen to multiple witnesses simultaneously. Some occur to people who had no prior knowledge of the plantation's reputation. Some involve specific details that later prove accurate but weren't known to the witness at the time of the experience. The question of whether the Myrtles is genuinely haunted may ultimately be unanswerable with our current understanding of reality. If consciousness can survive death, if emotional trauma can imprint itself on physical locations, if the boundary between past and present is more permeable than we assume, then perhaps the reports from the Myrtles represent genuine contact with something beyond our normal experience. Or perhaps the plantation is simply a beautiful old house where the combination of atmospheric setting, suggestive storytelling, and normal but misunderstood phenomena creates the perfect conditions for people to convince themselves they've encountered the supernatural. Either way, the experiences people report are real to them. They return from visits to the Myrtles changed, convinced they've encountered something extraordinary. And whether that something exists objectively or only in their minds may matter less than the fact that the encounter happened at all. As our journey through the Myrtles Plantation comes to a close, we find ourselves standing at the intersection of history and mystery, fact and legend, the documented and the imagined. This beautiful house, with its elegant galleries and its tragic past, has become a mirror in which we see reflected our own attitudes toward death, toward the past, toward the possibility that something of us might persist beyond the grave. The true history of the Myrtles is compelling enough without embellishment. It was founded by a fugitive from justice, built by people who had no choice in the matter, sustained by one of the great moral evils of human history. It witnessed the prosperity of the plantation system and its collapse, the violence of murder, and the slow erosion of abandonment. It has been rescued and restored, transformed from a private home into a public space where thousands come each year to glimpse the past. The ghost stories, whether true or not, serve their own purpose. They keep us engaged with history. They make us think about mortality and memory. They create narrative frameworks that make the past feel immediate rather than distant. The story of Chloe, though historically inaccurate, reflects real dynamics of power and exploitation. William Winter's murder, though embellished in the retelling, reminds us of the violence that characterized Reconstruction Louisiana. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let the story of the Myrtles accompany you. Imagine yourself walking those long galleries as twilight falls, Spanish moss swaying in the breeze, the old house settling around you with its creaks and whispers. Consider the countless people who have lived and died here over 2 centuries, their joys and sorrows, their hopes and fears. And if you ever find yourself in St. Francisville, Louisiana, consider visiting the Myrtles Plantation yourself. Walk through its rooms, stand on its galleries, listen to its stories. You may not encounter any ghosts, but you will certainly encounter history. You will meet the past in a place where it feels unusually alive. Thank you for joining me on this journey to one of America's most fascinating historical sites. Please leave a comment below letting us know where you're listening from and what time it is. We're delighted to hear from our listeners from all over the world. If there are any other mysteries, historical sites, or unexplained events you'd like us to explore in future episodes, please let us know. If you enjoyed this in-depth look at Myrtles Plantation, please remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any episodes. Share this with your friends who love history, mystery, and the endlessly fascinating questions that arise as we explore the shadows between the known and the unknown. Sleep well, dear listeners. And remember, whether home is watching you or not, the past is always watching, always waiting to share its stories with those patient enough to listen. Remember, tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Good night.